The hearing is now back in session. We will now hear testimony from Lieutenant Commander John Duffett with the Office of Commercial Vessel Compliance at U.S. Coast Guard Headquarters.
Good afternoon, sir.
Got it.
Lieutenant Commander Duffett, the board's recorder, Lieutenant Steele, will now administer your oath.
Good afternoon, sir. You can please stand and raise your right hand. A false statement given to an agency of the United States is punishable by a fine and/or imprisonment under 18 U.S.C. 1001. It may also be subject you to discipline under Uniform Code of Military Justice. Knowing this, do you solemnly swear that the information you're about to provide will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you. You may be seated.
Sir, I see you have co-counsel present with you today. Counselors, can you identify yourself for the record?
Good afternoon. Nat Eichler, Agency Counsel for the Coast Guard.
Good afternoon. Hillary Wise, Agency Counsel for the Coast Guard.
Thank you. Commander Duffett, thanks again for coming down from headquarters to be here today to help us with this investigation. If you at any time you need a break, just let us know and we'll take a recess. Lieutenant Commander Nicole Emmons is going to start the questioning, sir.
Good afternoon, Lieutenant Commander Duffett. All of my questions are related to your background with the Coast Guard Office of Commercial Vessel Compliance, laws, regulations, and Coast Guard policy. There's an exhibit binder available in front of you, and we'll put up any exhibit that we pull up on the monitors as well. And before I begin, I will ask you to please refrain from using any acronyms, and if we do, just kind of explain what they are. And we're going to kind of use the same acronyms over and over, so once we define what they are, we can use the acronym. Lieutenant Commander Duffett, please tell us about your history and background as it relates to vessel inspections and marine safety in the Coast Guard.
Good afternoon. I graduated from the Coast Guard Academy 2011, and my first assignment was as an apprentice marine inspector at Sector New York, where I was a marine inspector for 3 years, doing foreign flag container ships, tankers, small passenger vessels, and tank barges, among other types of vessels. After that, I went to a marine safety engineering grad school program, University of Michigan. And after that, I was assigned to the Coast Guard's Office of Design and Engineering Standards for 3 years in the Naval Architecture Division. And then after that, I was assigned as the chief of the Inspections Division at Sector Long Island Sound for 3 years, where managed a shop of marine inspectors that did inspections on a whole spectrum of different vessel types. And then after that, I was assigned to the Office of Commercial Vessel Compliance, where I've been working primarily on passenger vessel related issues for the past 2 years.
Can you go a little bit more into your position now and what you do as the passenger vessel compliance?
Sure. So there are one of the primary functions of the Office of Commercial Vessel Compliance is to publish policy for marine inspectors in the field and for field units to follow. And so when there are policies that need writing or reviewing or canceling related to passenger vessels, small passenger vessels, or even uninspected passenger vessels, they typically come to my desk. And in addition to policy, there's appeals that come from after a vessel owner or an operator disagrees with an OCMI, a field unit's decision on something. So we adjudicate appeals. We also participate and support our other headquarters offices with rulemaking, regulatory development. And so those are just a few examples, but any of those where there are passenger vessel implications, then I, like I said, typically take lead over the past 2 years anyway, since I've been there. And as well, because some of these some of these definitions that apply to passenger vessel evaluations also can apply to oceanographic research vessel evaluations. Those often sometimes come to my desk as well. And so there are other people who have worked on oceanographic research vessel issues, especially when they pertain to offshore energy or something like that. But like I said, because the definitions of passenger vessel that are relevant to passenger vessel evaluation and oceanographic research vessel issues often overlap, then I've worked on some issues with ORVs as well.
And what is the Coast Guard Office of Commercial Vessel Compliance?
The Office of Commercial Vessel Compliance is an office underneath the Inspections and Compliance Directorate, which is underneath the Assistant Commandant for Prevention Policy, CG5P. And we are tasked with implementing regulations, laws, international conventions by doing all those tasks that I outlined before, and many others. We respond to congressional inquiries. We participate on international committees and subcommittees. We interface with classification societies or third-party organizations. There's a whole list of other activities, roles and responsibilities that the Office of Commercial Vessel Compliance has, but they, as the title indicates, typically involve vessels and compliance with, some kind of regulation, law, policy, statute.
So you just mentioned compliance with regulations and guidance. What are the responsibilities in the creation of regulations and guidance?
I'll start with regulations. So there are a list of requirements that have to be followed whenever any federal agency is publishing regulations that put some kind of a burden on the public. It starts with the Administrative Procedures Act, but there's several other executive orders and that have to be followed, and it can be key parts of the process include notice and comment to the public, and economic analysis as well, environmental analysis. There are various steps that are involved in making regulations. And as a result, it's a long deliberative process. But there, like I mentioned, in commercial vessel compliance, as well as other offices, are on several active, developing several rules currently. So that's regulations. As far as guidance goes, guidance is more, I'll say, less, there are less, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is. Yeah, it's a less formal process, because, well, not because, but it's a less formal process because what we put out as guidance is generally not binding to anyone other than Coast Guard personnel, and we put disclaimers to that effect on all the guidance that we put out. Whether that be, and we put it out in several different formats. We have Commandant instructions, such as the Marine Safety Manual. We have navigation and vessel inspection circulars, or NAVICs. We have policy letters that, an office at headquarters might publish, CVC or, other offices at headquarters publish policy letters. We have, marine safety alerts, we have marine safety information bulletins, various ways of publishing guidance. Some, like I mentioned, some more directed at the field, instructing or directing field personnel on how to do marine inspection, certain marine inspection tasks, and others more directed at the public, in informing them of, some common confusion or something to that effect. So there are various processes for each of those different types of guidance that we put out. But they're all governed by internal Coast Guard headquarters processes.
Thank you. We're going to kind of switch to Coast Guard authority and jurisdiction. What is a Coast Guard inspected vessel?
Coast Guard inspected vessel is a vessel that has been issued a certificate of inspection by an officer in charge of marine inspection. They fall into several categories that are laid out in the law in 46 U.S. Code Section 3301. And of those various vessel types, before they're issued a certificate of inspection, the local field unit verifies that the vessels comply with the regulations relevant to that type of vessel, which are in the Code of Federal Regulations.
With respect to Coast Guard inspection laws and regulations, what is a vessel of the United States?
Well, a vessel of the United States is defined in U.S. Code. It's 1 U.S. Code, Oh, sorry, not 1. 46 U.S. Code 116. And it's a vessel that is documented under Chapter 121 of 46, which means it has a certificate of documentation from the Coast Guard. A vessel that's numbered under Chapter 123 of Title 46, which is a vessel issued a number by a state, or a vessel that's titled under the law of a state. So that's the definition from the 46 U.S.C. 116.
And if a vessel was required to be state registered but wasn't, would it still be considered a vessel of the United States and subject to Coast Guard inspection?
Well, I guess there's kind of two questions there. One is a vessel of the United States subject to inspection? The other is a vessel that should be numbered, would they be subject to those laws? You don't necessarily have to be a vessel of the United States to be subject to inspection. We have laws that describe which vessels, like I mentioned in Section 3301, that describe which vessels are inspected or are required to be inspected. And none of those definitions, well, there are very few of those definitions specify the flag of the vessel. So our laws are applicable generally to foreign vessels that are here in the United States as well, but we write in acceptance in the regulations and sometimes in the law. We accept either foreign inspections or inspection or that they hold international certificates in lieu of being inspected by with a Coast Guard certificate of inspection. So so that is the. Sorry, I'm trying to think of it. What the second piece of this was the Would you restate your
Sure.
question? Sorry.
If a vessel is required to be state registered but wasn't, would it still be considered a vessel of the U.S.?
I see. So I'd have to look closer at the definition of the vessel of the United States. But the 3 points that definition hits are that it is documented under Chapter 121, that it is numbered under Chapter 123, or that it's titled under the law of the state. So without looking closer at, whether they are, if they're required to but don't have a number or a document, are they a vessel of the United States, I couldn't say.
Kind of along those lines, but could a vessel that is documented or registered in a state still be subject to Coast Guard inspection if operating in international waters?
Yes.
Do you know what the requirements are for registration for submersible vessels in the United States?
So they would fall, it would be the same requirements for, as far as Coast Guard documentation, the same requirements would apply as to any other vessel. And that is if they're more than 5 net tons and are engaged in coastwise trade or fisheries, then they have to have a certificate of documentation. And otherwise, they can elect to be documented by the Coast Guard if they are over 5 net tons and doing anything else, including recreation. And as far as the requirements for state numbering, the requirements in 46 U.S. Code, Chapter 123, stipulate, and it's promulgated further in 33 CFR 173, that vessels that have any undocumented vessel with propulsion machinery shall have a number issued by a state authority in the state in which it's principally operated. So the those are, it's Chapter 121 and Chapter 123 are sort of the governing requirements for vessels, whether vessels have to be either documented or numbered.
Shifting gears again to small passenger vessel regulations. What is a small passenger vessel as per the United States Code?
The definition of small passenger vessel, and small passenger vessel is one of those in that list in Section 3301 that's required to be inspected. The definition is described in Section 2101, and it includes vessels that are carrying more than 6 passengers, including at least 1 for hire, certain other provisions related to chartering arrangements, submersible vessels carrying at least 1 passenger for hire, or ferries carrying more than 6 passengers.
And what is the definition of a passenger for hire as per the United States Code?
Well, it's a rather long definition, so I'll refrain from reading the whole thing, but, okay, passenger for hire, excuse me. Passenger for hire is a passenger for whom consideration is contributed as a condition of carriage on the vessel, and consideration is defined in our regulations further as an economic benefit, inducement, right, or profit, including pecuniary payment accruing to an individual person or entity, but not including a voluntary sharing of actual expenses of the voyage by monetary contribution or donation of fuel, food, beverage, or other supplies. So it's laid out in U.S. Code, and the definition of consideration is further described in our regulations.
Can you go into that, the definition of consideration?
Well, each case that, an easy example, you buy a ticket to get on a ferry to go from Bridgeport to Port Jefferson. You're paying money for a ticket. The money is going to the owner, the company. So that's an example of something that's pretty clear-cut consideration. Otherwise, each of the instances, there's a lot of ways that companies, operators, because of the definitions in U.S. code, will try to say, well, we're not buying a ticket, we're paying for the gas, or we're not buying a ticket, we're just paying for the ice in the cooler. And so every situation has to be evaluated on its own set of facts. And so it's hard to, without a clear set of facts in front of me, to say what necessarily is consideration beyond what the definition says.
Whose job is it to determine what consideration is then in the Coast Guard when they're evaluating that?
Sure. So the first line of decision-making with regard to any issues like this is the officer in charge of marine inspection. The cognizant officer in charge of marine inspection. So there's geographic breakdown of which Coast Guard units are the OCMI in various areas. And if there's ever a question about whether something is consideration or not, they're the first ones to do the evaluation. And then there's a possibility to appeal that, and it happens pretty regularly.
Can someone pay to become part of the vessel's crew?
So for that, you have to go to the definition of passenger. And one of the, generally a passenger is an individual carried on the vessel, except, and one of the exceptions is a member of the crew engaged in the business of the vessel who has not contributed consideration for carriage and who is paid for onboard services. So there's sort of a two-prong test, or I guess three-prong test, because they have to be engaged in the business of the vessel, they have to have not contributed consideration, and they have to be paid for what they're doing on board. And so your question was, can you pay to become a crew member? And my answer would be no.
What is the Coast Guard's role in regulating small passenger vessels?
So the Coast Guard is the primary regulator of small passenger vessels. We are the ones who have the authority to issue certificates of inspection, to conduct enforcement activities against vessels that are operating illegally, to control vessel movements and that sort of thing when the situation dictates. And that role is delegated to us in statute, by regulation, by DHS orders, by executive orders. I don't know the ins and outs of it, but Coast Guard is the primary regulator of small passenger vessels operating on navigable waters of the United States.
You mentioned certificate of inspection. Can you explain what a certificate of inspection is?
Sure, yeah. It's a document that describes the vessel's information. It describes the minimum manning required on a vessel. It describes the route it's permitted to operate on. It describes when it's due for out-of-water inspection and when certain components are due for inspections, like lifeboat lifting davits and pressure vessels and air receivers, that sort of thing. And it also has other conditions that may be applied to it that may include weather restrictions, or that when carrying a lesser number of passengers, that less crew is required. It depends on the vessel, it depends on the unit, because there are various geographic differences across all the OCMI zones. But the document itself is meant to be displayed. It's required to be displayed on board so that the passengers can see that the vessel, what conditions apply to the vessel. And a vessel is issued a certificate of inspection after it's completed an initial inspection, and then every year for small passenger vessels they have to do an annual inspection, and every 5 years they have to do another certificate renewal inspection. Other vessels are inspected at other frequencies, but that's what it is for small passenger vessels.
If a person was wanting to build their own vessel and they want to carry passengers, what is the first step to getting inspected or getting that vessel to comply with carrying passengers?
Well, so the best first step, we'll say, because people have start these projects in different phases of construction. Sometimes it's before there's any steel or aluminum or whatever laid down. Sometimes they are purchasing a boat that maybe was inspected 40 years ago, or maybe has never been inspected before. And so it depends on kind of where they are, where their starting point is. But if they're, your question sort of assumed, or you asked about if they're going to build a vessel, the first step is to, with their concept in mind, file an application for inspection with the cognizant officer in charge of marine inspection. And that sort of starts the process where the field personnel, Coast Guard field personnel, can walk them through all the requirements to make it as efficient as possible. Oftentimes, boats are constructed, and then they contact the Coast Guard when it's already in the water and they think it's ready to go. But what they missed was plan review and approval of all the engineering systems. And so from time to time, they have to redo all their fuel lines, for example, or replace the whole electrical system because it doesn't comply with Coast Guard requirements. So the earlier the better, and the first step is an application for inspection.
Is the plan review required for all passenger vessels before in that process? You mentioned plan review. Do they need to get a plan review?
Yes.
And you had mentioned kind of they contact the Coast Guard unit, but how do owner-operators know which steps to take, like how to go about this process?
So the regulations spell it out. There's sections in both, excuse me, Part 2, which is sort of the generic, the general inspection part, as well as in each inspection subchapter within Title 46 of the Code of Federal Regulations that spell out the process. The Coast Guard, every Coast Guard unit publicizes their contact info, so it's pretty easy, to contact a Coast Guard unit and get going in the right direction.
We're going to kind of go back a little bit when we were talking about consideration and passengers. It's kind of specific to Ocean Gate operations. But according to Ocean Gate HSE manual, mission specialists were people who helped fund the expedition while acting as crew. Ocean Gate on multiple occasions took at least 3 people on board who paid to become what Ocean Gate designated as mission specialists on missions that departed from U.S. cities. Under those circumstances, would these mission specialists be considered, or would this operation be considered a small passenger vessel operation?
Well, like we discussed earlier, if you have paid, then you don't qualify as a member of the crew. And so then what you would do, what the officer in charge of marine inspection would do, if presented this set of facts, would be compare what those people are, whether are they a passenger, are they the owner, are they the master, or against the, and based on that, determine if it falls into one of those categories of vessels in Section 3301 that's required to be inspected. If you are not a member of the crew and you're not the master and you're not an owner or a charterer, and you're on a submersible vessel, then you may well be a passenger and the vessel may well be considered a small passenger vessel.
Do you know how many inspected passenger vessels, submersibles, there are currently operating in the United States, specifically submersibles that currently hold a Coast Guard certificate of inspection?
A handful, 4 to 6. I haven't looked at that specific number recently, but it's no more than half a dozen.
We're going to kind of switch gears to the navigation and vessel inspection circular. Can you kind of explain to us what a navigation and vessel inspection circular is?
A NAVIC is, like I mentioned before, one of the ways in which Coast Guard headquarters publishes policy guidance to the field. And like I said, sometimes it's more aimed at the field, sometimes it's more aimed at the public, sometimes it's both. But it's just one of the mechanisms we use to put out guidance to the field. We have NAVICs, of course, on carrying passenger carrying submersibles. We have a NAVIC on steel repair, a NAVIC on plan review, several NAVICs about plan review, various other topics. They're all publicly available.
Lieutenant Steele, can you please pull up Coast Guard Exhibit 086, which is the Navigation and Vessel Inspection Circular 5, TAC 93, which is the guidance for certification of passenger carrying submersibles? You kind of scroll to the top for the title, I'm sorry. Lieutenant Commander Duffett, can you explain what this document is and what it's used for?
Sure. So this document is it's titled Guidance for Certification of Passenger Carrying Submersibles. And in recognition of the fact that the regulations for small passenger vessels were developed primarily with surface craft in mind, this document lays out what is an equivalent level of requirements that would result in an equivalent level of safety on board a submersible. And the it has a lot of the same sections as the regulations themselves regarding vessel structure, life-saving, fire safety, machinery, manning. But it's meant to sort of bridge the gap between what the regulations were written with primarily in mind, and this other operation that is also covered under the definition of small passenger vessel of submersibles.
So this is guidance to go along with the regulations. Do you know how this NAVIC came about, how it was developed?
I understand it was developed in the late 1980s as the Atlantis submarines were being constructed, but that's the extent of my knowledge of its development.
Lieutenant Steele, can you please go to page 9 under B2A? It states in there, submersibles carrying 6 or less passengers are uninspected vessels as defined by 46 U.S.C. 2101-42. Although not subject to inspection, these vessels must meet the requirements of 46 CFR subchapter C, uninspected vessels. Is this a true statement today?
No. This was written in the late 80s. And the date on it is 1993, but it was a time of there was a big change happening in both the regulations pertaining to small passenger vessels and passenger vessels, as well as the laws that pertain to passenger vessels and small passenger vessels. And so, the Passenger Vessel Safety Act of 1993 changed the definitions in Section 2101, adding submersible vessels carrying at least one passenger for hire into the definition of small passenger vessel. And so the NAVIC, while the guidance within it is still valid, the way it describes the definitions in the U.S. Code is not up to date.
So as you just mentioned, if this law changed in 1993, do you know why this NAVIC hasn't been updated to reflect that?
I don't know why, no.
Are there any other areas of this NAVIC that are out of date or haven't been updated?
I imagine, well, it talks about these definitions in several different places. And so there's those issues. But in general, we haven't, to my knowledge, been had applications for inspection for these vessels. And so, they haven't necessarily been challenged. And, so it's, so I guess otherwise, I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on submersibles. And so I don't know necessarily which other parts maybe aren't up to date.
How often are navigation and vessel inspection circulars reviewed and updated?
It varies, certainly. There are a number of them. And so it's pretty sporadic. It's, when a law changes, typically they are. But not necessarily in all cases. Obviously, this is one case where it wasn't, that didn't happen. And so, there's no set schedule for reviewing and updating NAVICs.
Lieutenant Steele, can you pull that exhibit back up, please? Again, we're still on Coast Guard Exhibit 086. Okay, go to page 16, please. So under hull structure, in section 1, it states the hull structure should be designed, fabricated, and inspected to the standards of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, ASME code for pressure vessels for human occupancy, PVHO TAC 1. ABS rules for underwater vehicle systems and hyperbaric facilities is considered to provide an equivalent level of safety. Do you know if carbon fiber hull meets either of these standards?
I don't know.
Can you go to page 17, please, under means of escape? It states in section D, 2 means of escape from the pressure hull are required by 46 CFR 177.15 TAC 1. Practically, this means that 2 hatches are required and must be arranged so that if one is not accessible due to fire or excessive trim, the other is. On the Titan, crew members and passengers were bolted in from the outside and could not escape the submersible from the inside. Does this meet the regulations as stated in this section?
So that section in particular, like I mentioned before, the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, all the way up to 1997, there was a lot of change going on in the regulations. The requirements now, they're still in Part 177 for means of escape, but it's Section 177-500. And both then, in the previous regulations and the current regulations, there are exceptions for small spaces, less than 30 square meters. So it's not necessarily true that 2 hatches would be required, although, escape from a submersible, it has implications on abandoned ship and, life-saving as well, in addition to, means of escape from a fire or something like that. So this is one of those instances where you would have to, look at a particular vessel and see, in this case, as far as means of escape is concerned, it probably complied because it was smaller than that space, the 30 square meters, and there are some other requirements. It's in Section 177-500, where it exempts small spaces for the requirement to have 2 means of escape. So I don't have the drawing for Titan here in front of me, but there's a in all likelihood it could have complied with this particular requirement.
Can you please go to page 28? Under dive site there in section C, the OCMI must specifically approve the dive site and an evaluation of prevailing weather and sea conditions, and the availability of natural shelter must be considered. If a U.S. submersible passenger vessel was inspected under subchapter T, can the OCMI review the Titanic wreck site if a submersible was diving at that site to mitigate safety concerns?
Would you mind saying that one more time?
Sure. If a U.S. submersible passenger vessel was inspected under subchapter T, could the OCMI review the Titanic website if the submersible was also diving at the site of the Titanic wreck site to mitigate safety concerns?
So you're asking if they could review the Titanic website?
Wreck site.
Wreck site. Oh, I suppose they could with information available, but that of course it's the depth of that wreck is way deeper than anything that is currently certificated, and so it would be pretty thorough and a pretty thorough evaluation process by an OCMI to approve anything like that.
Can you please go to page 29? Under the rescue section there, regarding rescue, it talks about divers and remotely operated vehicles. And then a little down on page 30, it states, remotely operated vehicles may be considered in lieu of divers. However, performance of all required functions must be demonstrated at the intended rated depth to the satisfaction of the OCMI. Can you explain what that means and why it's important?
Well, one of the, if not the, most important thing that we try to do is prevent injury, death, environmental damage. And so the ability to abandon ship, on a more traditional surface vessel, is something that's considered in both, crew training and the life-saving requirements, life rafts or life floats or inflatable buoyant apparatus. And so one thing inspectors do is they will simulate an abandoned ship drill. Sometimes, going over the procedures with crew, and to make sure that in the event of an emergency, that everyone knows what roles they have and that they know the equipment they have on board. And so this requirement is akin to that. It's if, worst came to worst, that the people on board could be rescued. And so it's it's a dry run, so to speak, of that rescue capability. Because obviously, exiting a submersible at any kind of depth presents more challenges than an abandoned ship situation from a surface vessel.
Is there a depth limitation for the certification of passenger carrying submersibles?
So the NAVIC has some guidance as far as what the depth, what considerations the OCMI should do regarding the approved depth. It discusses 45 meters as as a max depth, because that's again, I'm not a diving expert, but the depth at which a diver could still render some assistance to a disabled submersible. And beyond that, this is one way to comply. The NAVIC is one way to comply. There are other ways to comply, and if an operator could convince the officer in charge of marine inspection that their rescue arrangements are equivalent to a surface vessel, then that's, they're welcome to make that case.
Lieutenant Steele, can you pull that up one more time and go to page 10? Under section E on page 10. Sorry, is that page 10?
I would explain that.
Okay. It says under section E there, under regulation development, as more experience is gained with passenger carrying submersibles, regulations specific to them and their operations will be promulgated. Therefore, comments to improve this NAVIC are solicited and comments should be submitted to Commandant. To your knowledge, has the Office of Commercial Vessel Compliance ever received any comments to improve this NAVIC?
Not since I've worked there, but that's just 2 years. This NAVIC's been published for 30 years. And so I can't speak to before I was working there.
We're going to kind of shift again to the Marine Safety Manual. Lieutenant Steele, can you please pull up Coast Guard Exhibit 087, which is the U.S. Coast Guard Marine Safety Manual, Commandant Instruction 16000.71. Can you tell us what the Marine Safety Manual is?
The Marine Safety Manual is a Commandant instruction. It's the primary policy that the marine inspectors and other field personnel use when, excuse me, implementing the regulations.
And on page 1 there, under submersible vessels in section X, it states voluntary reports of submersible operations in or near U.S. waters may be made to the nearest Coast Guard Operations Center. Can you explain what that means?
Well, one of the roles of Coast Guard sectors, which, this term is also out of date, but, Coast Guard units, one of the roles is situational awareness. And so whenever there's something unusual or of a higher risk going on, it's something that the Coast Guard unit, the Sector Command Center in particular, would want to be aware of, just so that they can, respond quickly if there's some type of a call for assistance. So that's what this is referring to. It's not necessarily saying that all submersibles are voluntary, because as we've discussed, there are some submersibles that are required to be inspected by the Coast Guard, and so this is more just encouraging those that aren't necessarily subject to any inspections laws, and making sure that the Coast Guard is ready to respond to some situation that could come up.
And when it says made to the nearest Coast Guard Operations Center, we heard in previous testimony about the vessel traffic services. Does that, the Operations Center, is that a command center? Is that VTS? Is that the inspections department? Can you kind of go into where that's talking about or where that should be made, that notification?
Yeah, so I don't know exactly what an operations center is. As long as I've been in the Coast Guard, the closest thing that I'm aware of is the Sector Command Center. Some units have also a vessel traffic service, and it's similar. They do this. Keep an eye on vessel traffic, avoid prevent collisions, that sort of thing, and it's parallel line of effort in some ways to Sector Command Center, but the Sector Command Center is more focused on Coast Guard assets and search and rescue, pollution prevention, that sort of thing. So, like I said, I don't know exactly what Operations Center was, but nowadays what this means is notify the Sector Command Center.
In section 1(a) of regulatory oversight, it states, presently, the Coast Guard does not have inspection standards applicable to the design or construction of submersible vessels. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, I think that is just restating what the opening of the NAVIC states, which is that the regulations that do exist were designed or were developed primarily with surface vessels in mind. Later on in that same section, it refers to NAVIC 593, which is one example of inspection standards applicable to submersible vessels. But it's referring to inspection standards within the regulations.
And in that same section, it lists application of 46 CFR subchapter C and application of 33 CFR subchapter S. However, a submersible vessel that carries at least one passenger for hire, as you stated, is applicable to subchapter T. Do you know why subchapter T isn't listed in this section?
Yeah, it's the same reason that the NAVIC also calls out subchapter C. It's the law changed, and the manual hasn't been updated to reflect the change.
And do you know how often the Marine Safety Manual gets reviewed and updated?
There's no hard and fast rule. I know we have standards for commandant instructions, but I don't know exactly what the required schedule is.
We're going to shift to oceanographic research vessels, and we're going to use that term quite a bit in this next section. So for the record, an ORV will be referred to as oceanographic research vessel. Can you tell us the definition of what an oceanographic research vessel is?
Yes, an oceanographic research vessel is defined in 46 U.S. Code, Section 2101. It's a vessel that the Secretary finds is being employed only in instruction in oceanography or limnology or both, or only in oceanographic or limnological research, including studies about the sea, such as seismic, gravity meter, and magnetic exploration, and other marine, geophysical, or geological surveys, atmospheric research, and biological research.
And how does the officer in charge of marine inspection determine what is oceanographic or limnological research?
So there's a process that's laid out in 46 CFR Part 3 that governs the designation, the ORV designation. And it includes submission of a plan by the prospective ORV operator regarding what they're going to be doing with their vessel, who's going to be on board, what sort of research they're going to be doing. The OCMI would take their plan, evaluate it against the definition here in the law, and the definitions also in the regulations, and determine if it complies. Certainly if it's very clearly geological survey, well, that's right there in the list, so that's easy. If it's something else, then it's the OCMI has to determine, what's the, what is, whether it complies with the definition, whether it falls under oceanography or limnology or not. We have some further guidance in the Marine Safety Manual. There are some counterexamples provided in the Marine Safety Manual, including, it says, the study of celestial navigation, seamanship, scuba diving, and other topics has voided a vessel's claim of exclusive employment in oceanographic research. So there are some examples of what is oceanographic research, examples of what's not oceanographic research, and the OCMI is, has discretion in between those.
So how does a vessel become designated as an ORV?
So the process in 46 CFR Part 3 governs that. They first submit a plan, and depending on the tonnage of the vessel, if it's over 300 gross tons, then an ORV is subject to inspection, like we talked about before. Has to operate with a certificate of inspection, get annual inspections, out-of-water inspections. If it's less than 300 gross tons, then the OCMI similarly would evaluate the plan, determine that it is, in fact, falls under the definition of oceanographic research vessel, and it's issued a letter of designation that says the vessel's name. Oftentimes it refers to the plan that was submitted to the OCMI, and the regulations state that that letter is valid for 2 years, and then 2 years later, it's, the whole process is done again.
You had mentioned that over 300 gross tons, that the Coast Guard, there's an inspection process for an ORV. Is there any type of inspection process? I know you said it wasn't for under 300 gross tons, but is there any oversight other than issuing the letter that goes to a vessel that's under 300 gross tons?
Only as far as, verifying that the vessel and what it's doing meets the definition of oceanographic research vessel. If an OCMI deems it necessary to attend the vessel and go out with them and see that they're taking water samples or whatever they're doing, then potentially that, but nothing further is required as far as Coast Guard involvement.
And NAVIC 593, it's used to inspect, is NAVIC 593 used to inspect or designate ORV vessels similar to how it's used for Subchapter T carrying submersibles for ORV specifically?
NAVIC 593 is an equivalent to Subchapter T. That's its purpose. An uninspected ORV, i.e. less than 300 gross tons, wouldn't necessarily use NAVIC 593. An OCMI, if they saw some, hazardous condition or something where, they thought that operation, that uninspected vessel operation, posed some danger to the port, then they could go, they could control the vessel's movement, that sort of thing. But applying NAVIC 593 to an uninspected vessel would be very unusual.
So as far as ORV oversight, we heard in the last testimony that they required like an operations manual to be submitted. Does it change from OCMI zone to OCMI zone as far as what they require, or is there one standard for what's required?
So there's not necessarily an operations manual required for an ORV designation. There is in the NAVIC for submersibles that are inspected. What's required is a detailed description of the vessel, a specific operating plan, and any other information that the OCMI requests. So, an operations manual is something that would be used by the crew, be used by, the scientists on board potentially, but that's not in Part 3 as a requirement for getting a letter of designation. It's just the plan. Basically they have to make the case that they are exclusively employed in something that is oceanographic or limnological research.
Do all research vessels need a letter of designation? Oceanographic research vessels?
So to be an oceanographic research vessel is to be designated by the secretary as such, so, because it's in the definition. So you either are designated via a letter or you're designated via an endorsement on your certificate of inspection for the larger vessels. But absent one of those, then it's not an oceanographic research vessel.
And what happens when an ORV operates in multiple captain of the port zones? We'll go through a series of questions, but do they need to notify that OCMI zone?
Generally, no. If they're given a designation letter, just like if they're given, just like if a container ship is given a certificate of inspection, there's, they can cross OCMI boundaries. Typically, if it's something unusual, the inspectors at one unit, and if it's something unusual and the inspectors at the home unit are aware that the vessel is leaving for something, then they'll notify the away unit, so to speak. But there's not necessarily a limit on which OCMI zones they can go through. If a notification like that is made from one unit to another, and an OCMI sees something in the operating plan that raises a huge safety flag, then they could get involved because they have jurisdiction over the vessels operating within their OCMI zone. But that's unusual.
So the notification's not required from one OCMI zone to the other?
Correct.
Is it fair to say then that sometimes an OCMI zone, if they were not notified by another zone, they wouldn't know necessarily if operations were happening in their zone, if the owner-operator didn't reach out to them?
Certainly, yeah, fair to say. Like we've talked about vessel traffic service. If there's an ORV that is subject to the requirements of, to reporting to the VTS, then the VTS folks might inform the inspections people, or if there are other ways that information might get into the hands of the Marine Inspection Division. But it is certainly possible that vessel, crosses a boundary and the unit doesn't necessarily know the situation with that particular vessel.
For vessels over 300 gross ton that need an inspection, do they need a new inspection if they go to a new OCMI zone for those vessels?
Their inspection schedule follows what the regulations say, and it's not dependent on crossing an OCMI boundary. It's just a renewal inspection every 5 years, and I think for oceanographic research vessel, and annual inspection every year. So if they're if a vessel is initially certificated in San Francisco and their 1 year runs out when they happen to be in San Diego, then they'll request the inspection from San Diego. And that's normal for especially large vessels that make longer journeys.
Can an ORV operate in international waters or waters outside of U.S. jurisdiction?
So an ORV can operate on the high seas generally, as long as they're compliant with, there are certain other requirements that turn on when you operate on the high seas, particularly for an uninspected ORV, they fall under the safety requirements in 46 CFR subchapter C. And so there are certain requirements that apply to seagoing vessels, which is operating beyond the boundary line, which is established in 46 CFR. And so that might include a load line, for example. But to operate on the high seas, is not necessarily prohibited. It's just sometimes it turns on other requirements. To make a foreign or an international voyage is a different thing, because we have the U.S. is party to several international conventions. And an oceanographic research vessel, really any vessel that could be subject to, for example, the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS, that, a vessel that's subject to SOLAS that makes an international voyage without the correct documentation is subject to be detained by that port state. So you said, outside U.S. jurisdiction, so there are some limitations on where, especially if it intends to make a international voyage.
Can you kind of go into what an international voyage is? The
Yeah.
definition?
So I think it's defined in SOLAS, but it's a voyage to the territorial sea of a foreign, of a country other than the flag state of the vessel, and I think it excludes innocent passage, for example, but the a trip to the high seas, the middle of the Atlantic, Pacific Ocean, that isn't another country's territorial sea wouldn't necessarily constitute an international voyage.
Those additional requirements you were talking about for the uninspected passenger vessels on the high seas, does that include submersibles as well?
So it wouldn't, whether a vessel is submersible or not, it wouldn't change the evaluation. So if it's, if it falls under the applicability of those international conventions or the U.S. requirements for load lines, or maybe just the requirement to have an EPIRB where it didn't have to have an EPIRB before, it wouldn't necessarily change because the vessel happens to be submersible.
Can you kind of go through some of those? You just mentioned EPIRB, but can you kind of go through the other additional requirements for those vessels
To operate.
on the high seas?
Sure. Well, for an uninspected vessel, it's covered in 46 CFR subchapter C, and there's honestly not a lot. Especially for a vessel that's an oceanographic research vessel, there are more stringent requirements for an uninspected passenger vessel or a commercial fishing vessel. But for a vessel, an uninspected oceanographic research vessel, I don't have the list in front of me, but it's not for an uninspected vessel. It's not necessarily that difficult to comply. The hardest one would probably be a load line if they needed to have a load line, if they're more than 79 feet in length. But I'd have to look closer at the regulations to give you a thorough list.
Can a passenger vessel be an oceanographic research vessel?
So a vessel that's designated as an oceanographic research vessel, in the definition of that term, is engaged, it's employed exclusively in oceanographic research. Passenger vessel is also a defined term. That's a vessel over 100 gross tons, carrying more than 12 passengers, including at least one for hire, and there's some other chartering arrangements that it discusses in the statutory definition. But what if their operations as a passenger vessel, if in some way makes them not engaged exclusively in oceanographic research, then their designation is void, because they're no longer comply with the definition, and that verbiage is on the designation letter. I forget exactly what it reads. It's in the Marine Safety Manual. That if you do anything other than oceanographic research, and like I mentioned before, a lot of times the OCMIs will put on that letter the operating plan that was submitted to them. If they do anything other than that, then this letter is void, and then you can you evaluate the vessel and where it is and the tonnage and the people on board against all those other inspected vessel types, including passenger vessels. So assuming they are engaged in oceanographic research, it's important to note that under section 3306F, I think it's F, an oceanographic research vessel is not subject to inspection as a passenger vessel or a small passenger vessel because of scientific personnel. So if those people on board are scientific personnel, then it's not subject to inspection as a passenger vessel, even if they potentially contributed consideration and might otherwise be passengers for hire. So, you know, I suppose it's possible to fall under both definitions at once, but if you are truly an oceanographic research vessel, then you're not subject to inspection as a passenger vessel because of the scientific personnel.
I have a few questions about scientific personnel as well. We can get more into detail on that. I just want to kind of close up on the Coast Guard oversight. I know we talked about inspection, and there's no inspection for ORVs under 300 gross tons, but can you kind of go through the other differences in Coast Guard oversight as far as the differences in oversight between ORVs and passenger vessels other than the inspection and the designation? Is there any other differences in how we treat small passenger vessels and ORVs?
Well, the requirements themselves are much more stringent for any inspected vessel. You know, it's what's in subchapter T versus what's in subchapter C. You know, again, talking about a vessel that's under 100 gross tons in this case. You know, and along with that is the inspection piece, the Coast Guard involvement. But for an uninspected vessel, not just an oceanographic research vessel, but an uninspected passenger vessel, certain uninspected towing vessels, uninspected commercial fishing vessels, certain ones, they may be commercial, they may have regulations that apply to them, but the Coast Guard marine inspectors are not visiting them necessarily on a regular basis. It's not required by law for the Coast Guard to do so.
Does the OCMI need to approve the dive sites for an ORV submersible? I know we talked about on the inspection side, but I mean the small passenger side, but do they need to approve the dive sites for ORVs?
I would generally no, because like we talked about, the involvement of the OCMI in an ORV is under 300 gross tons, is determining that what they're doing is oceanographic or limnological research or instruction therein. So approval of a dive site, unless it is part of that evaluation, would be unusual.
And I know, again, we talked about this on the other side, but for ORVs, do ORVs need to notify the Coast Guard when conducting domestic operations?
For an uninspected ORV, it's every 2 years. They resubmit their plan. A lot of times they change their plan because they were on contract with the University of Washington, and then they're on contract with the University of Hawaii or whatever the case may be. But there's not necessarily, there's not a notification required for the uninspected vessels. Inspected vessels have some notification requirements because of repairs, limitations on repairs and alterations that can be made to inspected vessels. They have to be approved by the OCMI. So there's, notification along those lines. Both types of vessels would have to notify the Coast Guard in the event of a marine casualty or a hazardous condition. But the discussion we had earlier was when it crosses OCMI boundaries, do they have to notify the next OCMI? No, they don't.
Are there depth limitations for ORV submersibles?
It's the same answer. Only if comes into the evaluation of whether that vessel is exclusively employed in oceanographic research.
And what is the definition, and we touched on this, but what is the definition of scientific personnel?
So scientific personnel is defined in 46 U.S.C. 2101. It's individuals on board an oceanographic research vessel only to engage in scientific research or to instruct or receive instruction in oceanography or limnology. And, there are some other details, but that's the gist. So, as an individual on board who is only there to do scientific research, or to do oceanographic research, excuse me.
And just to be clear, can scientific personnel pay for carriage on a vessel designated as an ORV?
Yes. Yes, I would say that's the typical use of, some institution wants to hire a vessel to go and do oceanographic research, so they pay to put their scientists on board. So that's typical. But that doesn't, because of the exemption for passenger and small passenger vessel inspection, they can continue, being an uninspected vessel if it's less than 300 gross tons, or they're not subject to inspection necessarily because of those people.
And can children be considered scientific personnel?
They can. The definition of scientific personnel was revised in the Coast Guard Authorization Act of 2018, and it added that the age of an individual may not be considered in determining whether the individual is described, or may not be considered in determining whether the individual is scientific personnel. And so we put out guidance to the field along those lines. When this went out, when this law changed, that you can't use age in determining whether it's an ORV or whether they are scientific personnel. Excuse me, but the age of the people on board is certainly still a factor when you're considering, well, are they actually doing research or receiving instruction in research? An infant can't receive instruction in oceanographic research, for example. And then, of course, there's life-saving and other implications that an OCMI may use that are not necessarily the age and determining if that person is scientific personnel, but in determining if the vessel is fit for carriage of people of a young age.
Multiple testimonies over the previous days have identified a lack of consistency between OCMI zones regarding the interpretation of oceanographic research vessel designation guidance. How can this be remedied to ensure consistent interpretation of Coast Guard guidance for the submersible industry?
So the best way to remedy it is through the appeal process. Anytime there's a disagreement between OCMIs, for example, or an operator or a member of the public finds that one OCMI is treating them differently than another OCMI, there's a process for appeal, and it's actually described in section 3305D, that the commandant, shall ensure that OCMIs consistently interpret regulations. And so we do that with the appeal process, and also if it's an internal disagreement, we have a process, an internal process laid out in our policy for how to reconcile those differences.
And just to touch a little on credentialing, what credential would the master of the Titan Submersible need to operate as a passenger vessel at the Titanic wreck site?
Ocean Gate, before
Yes.
you answer.
Can I clarify, could you repeat, the jurisdictional question, I think here is important, and I just want to make sure we make that clear, because this is not U.S., this is complicated, but I'm just understanding, this is not U.S., the question is about operation by what type of vessel in which waters, just to be clear.
We could-
Commander Emmons, are you saying if the Titan were a U.S. flagged passenger vessel?
Yes,
what
sir.
credential?
Yes, sir. I'm sorry.
So, yeah, if a vessel, any vessel, was a U.S. flagged passenger vessel or small passenger vessel, then the master of the vessel would be required to have a merchant mariner credential endorsed as master for the type of vessel, the size of the vessel, and the area of operations of the vessel.
And on those same, the U.S. vessel, would that be the same requirement if the Titan was designated or if a submersible was designated as an ORV?
It would not be the same requirement, assuming it's less than 300 gross tons, which I think it is. The requirements for manning of uninspected vessels don't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily require a master endorsement on a merchant mariner credential. In fact, there's a tonnage. If you get to 200 gross tons, then even an uninspected vessel, even a recreational vessel, is required to have a credentialed master. But for an uninspected vessel, the minimum manning, it's all the manning requirements are described in 46 CFR Part 15, and if it's an uninspected ORV or uninspected, commercial fishing vessel or something like that, there's not necessarily any requirement to have a master on board.
Thank you, Mr. Duffett. That's all.
I was going to say, we've been going for well over an hour on some technical testimony. Why don't we take a recess just at this time and return at 3:15?